Hello, welcome to the Grand Rounds for Psychiatry today. Really appreciate you all being here, and we will go ahead and get started. Today I'd like to introduce Dr. Steve Brown. He received his Ph.D. in Applied Behavioral Studies in Education with a specialization in counseling psychology from Oklahoma State University. He also completed an American Psychological Association accredited internship at the University of Iowa and subsequently accepted a position as coordinator of career services in the Counseling and Testing Center at the University of Georgia. He worked at the UGA for 21 years, serving as director of the Counseling and Testing Center for 15 years. He has also served as an assistant professor in the Department of Counseling and Human Development Services. Currently, however, he is the director of the Counseling Center here at ETSU. He is an adjunct professor in the Department of Human Development and Learning and the Department of Psychiatry. Dr. Brown is licensed as a psychologist in Tennessee and as a licensed professional counselor in Georgia. Dr. Brown, thanks for speaking with us today.
Good morning. What I want to do today is basically bring forward kind of like the processes that we all go through internally in terms of how we make decisions, but also basically where we're coming from in terms of what we're telling ourselves. When you think about this, what we tell ourselves internally, that cognitive thought process, is our reality. We have what I like to call less conscious processes, which are things we're less aware of. I think for the most part, every human being has some awareness of most of what we do, think, feel, but whether we bring it up to consciousness and are able to use it is a whole other question. So CBT is probably the most researched, the most empirically based psychotherapy that exists today. It's very straightforward. We all do it, whether we want to admit to it or not. But I want to give you some frameworks because what I have, when I look at creativity, everybody's creative. It's really a matter of figuring out how you're creative. And I took a sidetrack when I was in grad school and went into educational psychology, largely for the purpose of learning how creativity works and how to develop it. Sadly, what I found as I did research in creativity is our educational process as a conformist activity, conforming to what faculty want, tends to decrease creativity. And I had a nice research project that I did on that, showed nice linear declines in creative ability as people went through grad school. And my department, of course, did not want me to do my thesis on that. But it's real interesting to watch. Students can become obviously more creative through the educational process. But so much of what we do is ask them to conform to standards. And that works against that creative development. Now, what I try and do when I look at my creativity is I tend to take more abstract concepts, things that are much more difficult to explain, and try and simplify them. And that's been what I've done throughout my career, because I want everybody to be able to use it. And that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today, is how to do quick work with CBT. And y'all are going to experience this. And the real question, and one of my highest values, is how open are you going to be to learning this stuff? How much are you going to pay attention? Because that's where we start changing ourselves. Okay, so cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm going to stand back here so I can see what I'm talking about. Straight across, it's a psychotherapeutic approach. Addresses dysfunctional emotions, maladaptive behaviors and cognitive processes, and contents through a number of goal-oriented, explicit, systematic procedures. How many of you followed that? How many of you would practice based on this, could walk out of here and say, this is what CBT is about? A couple of you. Yeah, exactly. I want you all to be able to. In principle, CBT reflects that cognition predicates many of our behaviors. If we can change the cognition, then we can change the behavior. Example, individual with low self-esteem generally has many thoughts of their own inadequacy. They live in their own world. If we can change the thoughts or refocus them on the individual's strengths, the self-esteem of the individual improves. the more they cycle that through their thoughts, the more it has a positive impact on how they feel about themselves. Now, before I go much further, I want to throw in a concept. And this is what I tell students in our class. Basically, every human being on the planet is trying to confirm themselves. That's why parents tend to want to make kids like themselves. They teach them their values. They model for them. And if they're not like them, they tend to correct them. Okay? It's a very egocentric state that we all start out in. And to be honest, there is a level of egocentricity that is quite helpful and healthy. That level is self-care. Because without that, we don't have resources to help others we care about. But then, when it goes beyond that, it serves as a trap. If we get stuck in the thoughts that this is who we are, this is the way we are, and we expect other people to be like that, then we become somewhat critical of others in defense of our own ego. Y'all with me on that one? Okay. So, the process. You raise your awareness of the specific content of your thoughts and feelings, particularly when you're feeling depressed or anxious. Sometimes keeping a journal is helpful. Identify the content of each thought or feeling. Most, if not all, thoughts or feelings will be negative and have at least some irrational content. And so we look for that content. What's irrational about this? What doesn't function for the individual? What causes stress? And then whenever you become aware that you're focusing on those negative, less rational messages, tell yourself to stop. And I emphasize, be gentle. Now, I have a slide up later that basically says why. Anytime you come down on yourself in a critical way, what do you create? Negativity and resistance. You are at any given point in time the most effective person you've been in your life. You have applied everything you have learned before that point in time. Now, sometimes we move into dysfunction, so we're not as effective. But we have all that has come before us is what we practice and what we live. And that's really shades our reality. The reason to be kind is if you're kind to yourself, understand, when you hammer yourself, you basically are locking yourself in. In fact, oftentimes I say that critical people stay critical because they hammer themselves, they pay their penance, and then they just repeat the cycle. And you get into a cycle of basically coming down on yourself over and over again with minimal change, if any change. And we have social systems that actually mirror that. So when you're gentle with yourself, you're more open to accepting the input. Firmness, only in the sense of make it consistent. Start really becoming aware of what you're telling yourself. Okay, and to identify what's really important to you in life values. And I want to walk you through just a piece again. I want you to think, once again, I've done this with this group before, but I want you to think of the 3 most important things in life. Just put them right up here. Y'all got them? 3 most important things in life. If you don't have them, I'm going to challenge you right off the spot. Because how in the world are you making conscious decisions if you don't include a reference point to what really matters to you in life? And this is an error that many, many folks have, is they aren't aware of their value system in a way to where they can apply it to making decisions consistently. They use the feelings they get rather than a straight cognitive awareness. And feelings are basically vulnerable to immediate gratification, emotional states. And in a while I'll show you why that works against us in a real direct way. But right now, you've got those 3 values. Getting your feeling states. I just took them away. How do you feel? I want to hear descriptors. How do you feel? You can't have those values. Angry? Come on, give me more. Helpless. Empty. Sad. So what are we describing? helpless, empty, sad, angry, are all parallel to what state? Depression. Okay? This is one of the things I find over and over again. It's when we don't carry our values forward in an aware fashion, where we really know what they are, we tend to set ourselves up to be depressed, to be angry, to feel helpless at times, to be insecure. All the things that we attribute to depression. And now, how many of you have had help in putting your value systems together in a way where you really apply them in a decision-making model? And that's what we spend 5 weeks in our course on. Values awareness, decision-making. Okay, so as the process continues, begin developing messages to counter the old irrational ones that are based on what is important to you and that are more rational in supporting the way of life you prefer based on your value system. To become aware of the more and become more consistent, telling yourself to stop the old messages and begin replacing them with the new that are based on the life you choose to live, based on your values, and then you practice doing that more and more. And over time, I assure you it works. Your mood tends to improve. You tend to feel better about yourself. And you're basically removing one of your early programs. Because the way I look at it in the world, in a more simplistic way, what you're looking at is every human being basically expresses distress on a continuum. I'm not going to say every, because we've got some deviation from that. But most human beings express it on a continuum from depression to anxiety. Okay? In here, in the middle range, that's normal human behavior. But when it causes us to lose our ability to function in certain areas, in key areas of life, then it becomes dysfunctional. And we have depression that's problematic or anxiety that's problematic. And the irony is what happens when people hit the bottom of depression? What happens to many of them? Let me hear. Louder. Well, it could be. Depression's the primary emotional state contributing to suicide. But have you ever noticed people, when they hit the bottom of depression, many of them have panic attacks? And when they hit the extremes of anxiety, the panic attack in, many of them get depressed. So to me, I see that working in many cases very much like that, where they hit the extremes and they're distressed and they go to the other end of the continuum. It's just a sad place to be, because anxiety, panic attacks are one of the least comfortable states that humans experience. And bottom line, depression, especially when it's chronic, is just a very sad, sad existence. But this is basically the premise. Now, I can walk you through this, which I have, and all of you will walk out today and start practicing it, right? No. I know better. This is what I find like in Beck's work. It's wonderful work. I can get my mastery of pleasure lists. I can get basically my logs, my thought logs, and all that stuff. And I will have about 10% of my clients follow through effectively on it. Even the ones who are very organized and systematic. But it's getting follow through that makes the difference. So let's see if we can short circuit this process a bit. Okay, now here's what I bring up again. Remember, you are the way you are because it's the way that has worked best for you up to this point in time. Okay? Now, we're talking about respect. So I always like to ask this because I've basically been spreading what I define as respect. You dance to it, you sing it, but what does it mean? I got Ph.D.s in this room. What's respect mean? You got M.D.s in this room. Come on, folks. Isn't this interesting? I find this common. Anybody willing to tackle respect? What is it? Honor. That's a good place to start. Okay. Now I'm going to state it this way, and I'll I'm real interested in feedback. Respect is learning to treat an individual the way that individual wants to be treated. Comments? That's true. And some clients don't even understand. They value that. But all clients have a framework when you push on it as to how they would like to be treated. And basically, honestly, if you're going to make traction, you match them, you get into their space, and then you start challenging them in ways to help them look at things somewhat differently, to maybe get to a point where they're willing to look at themselves as being worthwhile, having value. Almost everybody struggles with self-esteem at some level. But the premise of the model really comes down to self-respect, which is before you can really help a person change, if you're going to respect them, you got to understand where they're coming from. And so it almost always requires a conversation. The golden rule says treat people the way that you want to be treated. If you look at that from a respect model, that's pretty egocentric. So it really goes beyond that. And everybody's doing the best they can. This is a premise that I ask you to consider. Everybody's doing the best they can at that point in time, based on what they have experienced before. That's where we start. And even when they're functioning at a very low level, and it's very sad, in some ways they're doing the best they know how. So let's go through a couple of examples of this. First, I must be loved or at least liked and approved by every significant person I meet. Anybody believe that? I know I've got some good, strong extroverts in this room who try and live up to this every day of your lives. Trying to please everybody else. If you have a Myers-Briggs ENFP personality, sometimes they call that type of personality the chameleon. They adapt to everybody because they want to be liked. Okay? It happens. But the reality is much easier to live by. I always ask people when they say they want to be liked by everybody else, I ask them to think of the one person that they despise the most. How would it feel to be liked, loved by that individual? Do you really want that or not? Okay, so that's an example. Another example, must be completely competent, make no mistakes, and achieve in every possible way if I am to be worthwhile. Okay, y'all believe that one? Some of the management models that we use today are very much like that. They don't tell you what you do well, they tell you how you can improve. You never achieve a standard that's acceptable. You always have to look for what can be improved. This drives humans crazy. Okay? Now, bottom line, you get to the next one. I want to do some things well most of the time, like everyone else. I will occasionally fail and make a mistake. I'll guarantee you in this way. A lot of our students, we see it in college, have never learned to deal with failure. We set them up. We don't give them an adequate education to do college work. They hit college. They've made A's all the way through high school. And all of a sudden, they're lucky if they make C's. And they are in shock. And they don't, what's wrong with me? And in essence, it's a failure of the system to basically help them understand how to work through failure and how to improve themselves. This one hits a lot of our students. Okay, another example. Human unhappiness, including my own, is caused by factors outside of my control. So little can be done about it. Okay? Depressed people like this one. It's not my fault I'm depressed. The world's against me. I can't do anything to make it better. The hopelessness. And then the alternative. My problems may be influenced by factors outside of me or my control, but my thoughts and actions also influence my problems, and they are under my control. I emphasize to every individual I work with, you do not have the ability or power to control everything around you. You have the ability to influence it. And you have more ability to influence yourself and your own surroundings than anybody else. So understand you won't control it, but that you can have influence. You know, we can't change the world overnight. We can do a lot to change our microcosms that we each live within. Comments? Questions? Okay. So, here's another way of looking at it. People who focus their thoughts on the past tend to live in their past disappointments. The only positive gain we get from the past is what we have learned from it. If we continue to relive it, that is our current life. That is a real issue with a lot of depressed folks. They continue to relive all the disappointments over and over again, and their expectation is it doesn't get better. Somewhere along the way they've lost hope, or maybe it's been modeled for them, it doesn't get better. People who focus their thoughts on the future tend to worry about things that will never happen, that's wasting their lives. Okay? When we look at research about how worry works, a byproduct of anxiety, 99% of what people worry about never happens. So you can worry about it. In fact, when you worry about it, you practice it. So you increase the probability something bad will happen, because that's what you're expecting. And yet most of us in this room, if not all of us, were taught, modeled that we needed to be anxious. Why do I say that? How much motivation do you get out of depression? Little, if any. How much motivation do you get out of anxiety? Significant amounts. So folks who are in higher education, if you look at it, and it follows our client population, tend to have more anxiety than any other issue. They've been trained. They've got to be good. They've got to keep pushing at things. Okay? But it often ruins the quality of their existence because they worry about things all the time. You know, only benefit you get from the future is basically dreaming about it. How do you want it? To get clear as to what things matter in your life, and then to practice developing those dreams so that when events happen in life, your mind is trained to pick up opportunities to lead you closer to what you really want. I'll digress and tell you a little story. When I finished my master's degree, I had not planned to get a doctorate. But the way master's programs work, they had already suckered me into the doctoral program in a very honoring way. But my mentor sat me down, and she said, okay, you've been helping people with vocational psychology for 18 months now. So before you enter your doctoral program, I want you to do for yourself what you've been doing for everybody else out there. So she said, I want you to drop an ideal job model, and I want you to test it. So being the realistic person I was, my ideal job model was simply this. I want to do counseling. I want travel. I want music. I want a good salary, a 4-day work week, a 3-month vacation. I want a ski and backpack every weekend. What do y'all think? 2 months later, I'm in the state of Colorado working for the Department of Occupational Education. They put me on a 33-foot Winnebago classroom unit and said, go to the Western Slope, work with communities, high schools, and colleges, and do vocational counseling. In 2 months' time, they cut me from 5-day work weeks to 4-day work weeks because my average work week was about 80 hours. The van went over in a very nice way. And so I had 3-day weekends, never had a place to live in Colorado. I would not call what I was doing skiing, but I fell down lots of mountains, and I did a lot of backpacking. And 2 years later, after working with 5,000 people, I realized my values. I needed to finish what I was telling what these students and these adults, if you don't really go for your potential, then you never realize what you can really do for the world. And I caught myself in that. So I'd been taking some of my classes for my doctoral program and went back and finished my doctorate. It was hard to give up that job. But it's carrying the dream forward. And I really encourage, for everything we do in our lives, that's a much healthier way to look at it, is to have a dream about how we want it and to work to realize that dream, rather than worrying about all the things that go wrong, which is what so many of us have been trained to do. When I was a kid, I used to take great delight. My mother was so anxious. We'd get in the car, we'd drive around. We hit certain parts of town. She would always lock all the doors and be super anxious. So my joy as a child was unlocking them without her awareness. Okay, so common errors in the ways we think. All or nothing, dualistic. Kohlberg says it's a very low level. This is where we find a lot of people in our world. It's right if it confirms me. It's wrong if it doesn't. Okay? Dualistic. The world's not dualistic, folks. There's so many shades of gray in how it really works. Overgeneralization. Well, it worked this time. Sure, I can get by. I don't have to study tonight. I can get by on that test. I'll just kind of BS my way through it. It's worked before. This was anatomy. Won't work that time. Obsession with the negative. Everything's bad. We have people who have grown up in systems where they expect things to be bad. Discounting the positive. Having a case of the shoulds. Okay? And we're going to get into this a little deeper as to where these voices come from. Because they're all kind of internal voices we have. And we've got some good models in therapy which basically explain how they work. Making everything's going to be terrible, and this is an error we see. In fact, if you go to Mahabrian's research on couples, in conflict, only 3% of what people say gets through. 97% is based on two factors: nonverbals, body language, etc. But the interesting one is, about a third of what gets through is what the other person expects you to say. They're playing the tapes, so they're not even listening at all. We've gone through this before. It's going to be the same way. I'm not going to give you a chance to basically, I'm not going to listen to you. That's what it comes down to. Expecting others to change to meet your needs. I see this as the biggest issue in marriage today. We do very little effective premarital counseling. Couples come together, both of them carry patterns from their families of origin. How many times have you heard that statement? Well, when we get married, it'll be different. And it'll be different, all right. But those two systems are going to come increasingly into contact. And if egocentrism's too high, which it generally is, then it's conflict. Okay, and you must be absolutely right all the time. Don't you love folks like that? It's a way to protect the ego. I'm always right. And in a way, that's true, because you're always right for yourself. Maybe in the right way, maybe in the wrong way. Okay, now, why is it so hard to change? Well, one, it's disrespectful to even ask yourself to change because you're doing the best you can at any given point in time. So there's natural resistance. But then there's all kinds of other things we add in. The human list, and there's about 20 of these. But ways in which we protect ourselves. Keep in mind, the primary state of humans, we seek out homeostasis, keeping things the same. It's such an ironic twist that we try so hard to keep things the same when the only constant with any life is change. And that's the challenge. So we use all kinds of defense mechanisms. Denial, it just simply doesn't exist. The first stage when people find out they've lost somebody, quite often is denial. It didn't happen. I'm not going to deal with it. When you find out you've hurt somebody, sometimes our reaction is to go into denial. No, I didn't do that. How many times has your perception of an event been different than somebody else's? And it's the subjective experience that determines the impact. Rationalization. You can explain anything. You know, we hear students all the time, oh, it was just the way the professor set up the test as to why I did so poorly. None of you have ever heard that, right? Projection, it's not my fault, it's yours. Regression, just going to an earlier stage of development, acting out or whatever. Acting out's the next one. Humor is a positive defense. Just laugh it off. Sublimation's when we talk about as a positive defense because we take the energy from the distress and turn it, channel it into something productive like work. But these are all ways to avoid basically dealing with the dynamic at times that we really need to address. Assertiveness, being open, honest, and direct. That's a healthy defense mechanism. It's one of the cleanest ways to alleviate distress. You know, how many of you believe in honesty? Okay, so are you always assertive? Assertiveness is only open, honest, direct communication. Yeah, I see some of those smiles that say, I got caught in that one. You know, but if you want to live honestly, you're going to lower your distress levels. I guarantee it. You may increase others' distress levels somewhat. But if you're really honest and you use tact and timing, I don't know any better way for people to go through life. We all start out with high egocentricity. That's the child's position. Everything's for me. I see it, I like it, I want it now. Through life, some of us moderate that. Others don't. Some people, you know, as you go through, if you understand or have looked at Kohlberg's work on moral development, basically it's almost a linear decline of egocentricity as you go up in moral development. You start looking at more of a cultural centric or a different base for what's important than self. And here's some of the way it works. It's true because I or we believe it. So therefore, this is a dualistic thought. Since I believe it, you're wrong. We see this in every element of our society, every element of our political structure, because you know we are not a research-based society. If we really used what we know, education would be a very different process. So would a lot of things we do in our culture. You know, the way we treat children in our court systems, if we use the research, it would be very, very different. But no, our culture says this is the way we need to do it. It's a very egocentric or cultural-centric dynamic. And when it gets egocentrism, the only problem with it is inevitably it's going to hurt other people at some level, unless there's some unless in there. It's true because I've always believed it. This is family of origin dynamic. This is what happens when two members of a couple get together. All of a sudden their rules clash. And they have to either develop a means of resolving that conflict in a positive way, or they start having attrition in the relationship. It's true because it's in my own selfish interest to believe it. I'm wealthy. I don't want to pay higher taxes. So the rest of the people who make less than I can pay higher taxes. It contributes to homeostasis, reduces our ability to adapt. Okay? It does. Egocentricity, we keep things the same. If we don't look at other options of living, we maintain ours as the best. And in the end, it contributes towards discrimination. Because if I'm right, you know, most folks have never seen the basic model of discrimination. It's XXO. That's what it is. When you remove resources, who gets together to grab the resources? The folks who are most alike. They confirm each other. And basically, if the resources are short, or even in the interest of having more than the other, the tendency is to look for some line in the sand to discriminate towards another individual. Okay, so here's the sources. You've all heard Freud stuff, id, ego, superego. He's got a reactive child built in there. Transactional analysis is another, and to me, a cleaner way to look at it. Child, parent, adult. Okay, these are the sources. Now, where's your voice coming from? What is the voice that you find yourself rotating up here the most? So let's go through them. The child, I see it, I like it, I want it now. Immediate gratification. Is that where you find yourselves? Most of you don't find yourselves there predominantly. Okay? Some people do, though. Is it the adult? The adult is driven by a value system, by a principle, code of living, by principles that they end up defining as what matters to them in life. This is what I consider the missing link in helping everyone come to a point of having that self-drive, of having that validation. I'm living what I believe. This is the process where people develop integrity. It doesn't matter what you believe, but if people can trust that you will respond to things over and over again in a very systematic way, a very consistent way, they learn to trust you for that. They may not agree with you, but they say you have integrity because they can trust you'll behave in a certain way. Okay? If you don't get to the place where you understand the constructs you're living your life by, that's very difficult to develop. Because it becomes clearer as you get those constructs. Are you living up to them or are you not? This is your own code. And it's something, as I say, it takes time to develop. And there are processes we've developed that help people get there and are basically help them make better decisions and more consistent decisions. Superego. Remember that shoulds, case of the shoulds? This is the parent voice, and primarily it tends to have a critical element at times, and some people, depending on family system, but it tends to basically, you should live this way. Ironically, when I see some students, their parents, quite often they describe their parents as being from the hippie generation, they're liberal, and they don't know, their parents aren't telling them they should do something, they're telling them, make your own decision. The only problem is they don't know how to make a decision. Okay? But they're not really hard on themselves, but they do pick up that anxiety depressive curve, either a self-criticism or a perfectionism that comes in when you have that anxiety curve. This is the place, the parental position for many of us is where you should live this way. And so the voices we hear in our heads when we don't do something or when we're worried about something are more critical. And so for many folks, especially as I say, it goes along with the anxiety curve. That's the internal voice we hear. It's a judging voice. How do y'all like that one? Because go ahead. Until they learn decision making based on principle. Because I guarantee you, I totally agree with what you're saying. We see the same thing. But it's a wonderful process to watch as an individual becomes aware of what matters and can see models of decision making and then can apply their principles to decision making and their answers become clear. I'm not going to say they're always black and white because they're not. But they definitely, basically, they can either check if their feelings are validating their decision or if it's consistent with the principles they say they're living by or not. And it gives them a power of self-checking. And it's not it takes away some of the criticism or that lack of clarity by simply having those awarenesses. Okay? Now, what happens when people tell you you should do something and you don't want to do it? How do you feel? You should only spend 10 minutes with every patient you see. How do you feel? You only have 30 minutes for psychotherapy. How do you feel? Okay? Quite often you get the reactive self at that point. If the person, whatever that message is so disrespectful and it goes against what you believe, we go into our lesser self all too often. And in the reactive state, that tends to be when we act out in ways we later regret. We say things we later regret. We do things we later regret. We tend to act out in ways that are self-defeating or even self-destructive. I even toss this in for a lot of our suicidal folks, because they'll go to that self-destructive place, and you talk to them after they've gone through it, after they've anchored to some hope points, and all of a sudden that's not even a relevant place to consider. But in that moment it was. Okay? We don't do ourselves favors when we're in that reactive space. In couple relationships, the pressure, the difference between the people's value systems and their family of origin dynamics often creates that reactive dynamic because they feel disrespected. So, my question for you all to consider is, what's the predominant voice? What position is it coming from? Because all of us have it. Okay, and sometimes it triggers guilt. If you got a bunch of shoulds up there, then you are prone to experience guilt. Part of our culture teaches guilt. Now I want to ask you a question. How positive is guilt as an emotion? What do you get from it? Sometimes, why? How so? Okay, SWATs can work the same way. Don't you think? My point being, do you really want to have guilt be the reason you do something positive? Or do you think it's healthier to have people go back to what matters, their principles, and make choices based upon what matters to them as to the primary reason they're changing behavior? The problem I see with guilt is we get trained with it, and basically a lot of people use it quite well. I'm going to feel guilty for a while. If I feel guilty long enough, then I've paid my penance and I can do it again. Okay, once a person becomes principled and aware, I'm not sure guilt has a real significant positive input. If you're driving your life by what matters, then you know when you've done something wrong. You always fix what you've done? No. You are a human being. You will make mistakes. When I walk into groups, I always say, I want everybody to stand up who doesn't have a psychological issue. How many people stand up? Nobody. And if one person does, the whole group's on their back. The reality is we all have issues. That's an acceptance point. But guilt does not fix the issue. And becoming a principled human being has the potential to bring out your consistency and basically challenge yourself. You can't fix things you've done wrong. There is the concept of balancing, where you realize you've done someone wrong and you can do something for them, and especially if you treat them in a respectful way, you figure out what matters to them, so the way you balance is doing something that they appreciate. But you have to ask them, have to know what that is. Because it's weird what different people appreciate. There's a wonderful exercise that I use with couples called Caring Days. And in that exercise, basically, each member of the couple write down things they appreciate the other person doing. They make these long lists. At some point, they trigger them. And every day, they pull something from the list and do it for the other person. Okay? Each one pulling from the other list. Over time, what they're doing is they are being educated as to what their partner really likes. As their partner does it, then they get confirmed that they have value in the relationship. They tend to be more willing to go into deeper space of intimacy to share if they feel that their partner's listening and responding to them in positive ways. It's a wonderful activity to get involved in. The only expectation of the partner is they've got to notice and say thanks, express appreciation in some way. So you reinforce the person for doing those things. Comments, questions, rejections? You notice I'm going to add something for every one of the 4 positions. Okay, so here's a quick way to do CBT. I want you all to play with this. Everything in your head, all those cognitive loops. Of course, you would never say anything to yourself that you would say to your best friend, right? How many of you are as kind to yourselves as you are to your best friend in your internal thought process? You get the point? So, basically, if you use that one piece, for us in psychotherapy, it's almost like a Gestalt technique. I often say, okay, you're no longer, the client's over here now. You're this client's best friend. What are you going to tell them that's different from what you'd tell yourself? And it's amazing how much kinder they are to the other person than they are to themselves. Now, it's the same challenge for you all, is to start paying attention. What are you telling yourself? Walk it through that filter. Are you being as kind to yourself as you are to your best friend? And if not, what stops you? Comments, questions, rejections? Okay, once again, I've said this earlier, what misses is helping people define the principles they want to lead their life by. There's all kinds of reasons this happens. In our public education system, a lot of school systems do not want anybody talking about values. They should be taught at home. Okay? And we hear this. I've seen programs, I was part of a federally funded program that was axed because the superintendent did not like the idea that his next door neighbor did not like the program. And basically this was a very effective program that was reducing drug and alcohol addiction in teenagers. And we had good data supporting it, helping them get in touch with what mattered. And are they going to treat themselves in a respectful way or not? Decision-making skills. How many of you literally know how many steps and what the steps are you use in decision-making? Think about it. In our class, we have students write down their baseline. Most people write 3 or 4 steps. We expose them to the classic 7-step model of decision-making, and we found this wonderful 18-step model. And so we basically have them look at it all, think about it, process it, practice them, and determine what steps they're going to add to their process. So they walk away with a process that they have selected that comes from good, validated research. And so just consider what life's like, how it's different if people are principled and making good decisions. Sadly, with our current students, I can walk into a classroom and ask them about current political issues or current events, and they aren't even aware. They have no awareness of what's going on. I do an exercise in my class where I take all the presidential candidates in election years. Generally there's about 20 of them. And AARP and some other groups put where they stand on positions on nice charts. So basically I walk in and I remove all the names, and all they have are the positions, and they have to choose the candidate they're going to support. Less than 5% will actually choose the candidate they support when they're choosing based on where the candidate stands on the issues. Goes back to 1960s and what we found with the Kennedy-Nixon debate, and why we have so many negative political ads today. Okay, so assertiveness, come back to that. Honest, open, direct communication, the reason I bring it in is when people become more honest with themselves and they walk through their defense mechanisms, they start living life in a more realistic way. They know how they protect themselves from being honest. And primarily, It's a matter of tact and timing. Assertiveness saves pain in virtually every relationship. And keep in mind, relational dynamics are primary in two of the most important issues for humans. Okay? Relational dynamics are the thing that make relationships last in good ways. We know that. When we live in a society where we have more than 50% of the number of people getting divorced each year is who get married, where we live in a society where 85% of the people who are married say they're unhappy, with the predominant number being women, something's not working. You know? And we aren't teaching our young. Once again, we know a lot about how family systems work, how couple dynamics work. Our students aren't getting it. They are not being exposed to that information. The other angle is folks who keep their stress levels low. Primary inputs for human happiness and lower stress are positive human relationships. It's the strongest reducer we have for stress. It is the most powerful thing in terms of human happiness. And it's important to be kind to yourself, to basically recognize non-affirming and affirming thoughts. But when you basically are hard on yourself, to understand you're playing with two different awarenesses. You're playing with a less conscious awareness and basically what we have as cognition. And also often our resistance to change and our resistance to taking care of ourselves comes from the patterns which are more or less conscious. And I don't like the term unconscious because I think for what most people consider unconscious, there are little cues we get if we pay attention, that behavior is there, or that feeling's there, or that dynamic's there. It's not clear in our cognitive process, but as you pay attention, it becomes clearer. So you replace negative thoughts with affirmations. I even have a little ball in my office, like the ones you turn over to get answers, and it's an affirmation ball. I also have the sarcastic ball, so we can play them back and forth with each other. But basically, starting to think of yourself in positive ways, basically reflects self-respect, treating yourself the way you would like to be treated. And this is so much of what we encourage folks to do to get into a place where you are respectful of yourself. The whole concept of wellness. Students resist wellness to no end. 18 to 24-year-olds, they don't want to hear how to take care of themselves. They want to push the limits. That's a developmental stage. That's part of why they die more often. Accidental death is the #1 cause of death for adolescents. They push limits. And you tell them how to take care of themselves. Many of them have negative self-esteem, so it does not even fit to tell them to take care of themselves because they don't value themselves.